Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Vanished in broad daylight, the unsolved case of David Lang. It was a calm afternoon, a day like any other. The sun was high, casting a warm glow across the Tennessee countryside. Birds chirped, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze gave the air a sense of serenity. But this peace was about to be shattered. David Lang, a man of the land, was out in the fields tending to his horses. He was a hard-working farmer, his rough hands and calloused palms a testament to the years of labor he'd put into his farm. Nothing extraordinary about his day. He had his routine, and he followed it to the letter. His wife, Sarah, stood on the porch, watching him work. She waved, a smile on her face as she called out to him. It was just another moment in their peaceful life together. The kids were playing nearby, oblivious to the strange events that were about to unfold. Nearby, a man in a carriage was approaching. Judge August Peck, a respected figure in the community, had come to visit David. He waved back to David, his horse clip-clopping along the dusty road. It was a simple, picturesque scene. The kind you see in movies, a snapshot of rural life at its finest. But the next moment would change everything. David turned his head, catching a glimpse of the approaching judge. He waved, his heart light with the usual greeting. The simple act of a man acknowledging another. Nothing strange, just two men, one farmer and one judge, going about their business. But something wasn't right. As David moved a step forward, a strange feeling seemed to hang in the air. The world around him suddenly felt off. The breeze seemed to still, the birds stopped singing. It was as if time itself had paused. In an instant, David disappeared. 1 second, he was there, standing on the edge of the field. The next, he was gone. There was no sound, no cry for help, just a sudden and utter absence. Sarah's eyes went wide with shock. Her smile faltered, her hand frozen mid-wave. She blinked, trying to process what had just happened. Was she imagining it? Had David simply moved out of view? No, something was wrong. Something terrible. David, she called out, her voice shaking. Her heart raced as she rushed to the spot where he had been standing moments before. She couldn't believe it, but the field was empty. Not a trace of him. No footprints. No disturbance in the grass. She screamed his name, her voice filled with panic. There was no answer. The only sound was the wind, whispering across the empty field. It was as though the world had swallowed him whole. The children ran to her side, asking what happened. Sarah, now breathless and desperate, couldn't explain. She looked around, hoping for some sign that David was just out of sight, maybe behind the barn, maybe somewhere nearby. But there was nothing. The ground where he had stood was undisturbed, smooth and untouched. No hole, no sign of struggle. Just the same peaceful scene as before. But David was gone. Sarah didn't wait another second. She ran to the edge of the field, her heart pounding, her thoughts racing. David, she screamed again. But there was nothing. No response. No sign of him anywhere. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by Sarah's cries. Some thought it was an accident. Maybe David had fallen into a hole, or had hidden himself for some unknown reason. But as the search continued, the confusion only deepened. They combed the field, scouring every inch of land. The ground was flat, no holes, no pits. The horses were still in the stable, untouched. No sign of any disturbance. It was as though David had simply vanished. Hours passed, then days. The town began to wonder what had happened to David Lang. Was he kidnapped? Did he run away? But deep down, they all knew this wasn't just a case of someone leaving. This was something much darker. Sarah never gave up hope. She continued to search for days, calling out to him, hoping against all odds that David would return. But he never did. And as time went on, the mystery deepened, consuming everyone who knew him. Strange whispers started to spread. Some said they'd heard faint cries late at night, coming from the field where David had vanished. Was it his voice? Or something else? A voice from beyond? To this day, no one knows what happened to David Lang. His disappearance remains a chilling mystery, one that still haunts the town of Tennessee. Was it an act of the supernatural? Or something beyond human comprehension? Some questions are never meant to be answered. David Lang, a man of the land, was out in the fields tending to his horses. He had a strong bond with the earth, as if the soil beneath his boots was a part of him. For years, he'd worked this farm, pouring his blood, sweat, and tears into the land. His hands were rough from the constant labor, calloused palms, cracked fingers, and dirt-stained nails, all signs of a life lived in tune with nature. The smell of fresh earth filled the air as he walked through his fields, guiding his horses with a calm, practiced ease. He didn't mind the long hours or the relentless work. To David, it was a way of life, a sense of pride he couldn't quite put into words. The rhythm of farm life was his constant companion. He woke up before the sun, worked under its harsh rays, and went to bed with the stars above. His days were as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun, and that was exactly how he liked it. The farm wasn't just a business for David, it was his legacy. It was the place where he had grown up, learned the ways of the earth from his father, and now he was teaching the same lessons to his children. His house, modest but sturdy, stood at the heart of the land, a testament to his hard work and determination. Today was no different. As he led the horses into the pasture, he was in his element. The animals trusted him, and he trusted them. The sound of their hooves hitting the earth was like music to his ears. He whispered to them softly, reassuring them as they moved across the field. Every gesture was deliberate, every movement fluid. He knew this land better than anyone else. Despite the sweat on his brow and the aches in his muscles, David felt a sense of satisfaction as he looked around at the land he had cultivated. It was a good life, a simple life, but it was his. And in this quiet corner of the world, that was all that mattered. The air was crisp, the sun warm, and everything seemed to fall perfectly into place. His wife, Sarah, was on the porch, watching him with a smile on her face. She always admired how he worked the land with such devotion, how he seemed to be so connected to everything around him. It was as if he was part of the very earth he worked on. She loved him for it, and it was a love that had only grown deeper with time. Their children played in the yard, running around in the dirt, their laughter filling the air. Life was simple, and for David, that simplicity was a blessing. He took pride in providing for his family, in ensuring they had everything they needed, even if it meant sacrificing his own comfort. Today, as he worked the fields, there was a sense of peace surrounding him. He didn't know it yet, but this would be one of those days that would forever change the course of his life. He was unaware of the events that would unfold, unaware that this ordinary day would soon be clouded with mystery and fear. The sun hung high above, casting a golden glow over the landscape. David paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow, and took in the beauty of the land. Everything was quiet, everything was calm. For a man like David, there was nothing more satisfying than knowing his hard work had brought this peace. As he continued walking through the field, he noticed the familiar creak of the gate at the edge of the farm. A carriage was approaching. It was Judge August Peck, a man David had known for years. The judge often passed through the area, and today he had come to visit. David stood for a moment, watching the carriage as it slowly made its way down the dusty road toward his farm. He could hear the rhythmic clip-clop of the horse's hooves on the dirt, and for a brief moment, everything seemed like it always had, normal, predictable, and unchanged. He waved at the judge, acknowledging his presence with a friendly nod. The judge waved back, smiling as he continued his journey toward the farmhouse. David had known the judge for many years. Both men had grown up in the area, and they shared a quiet respect for each other. It was at this moment, as David turned to wave at the judge, that something in the air shifted. The wind, which had been a soft, comforting breeze just moments before, seemed to still. The birds, which had been singing and chirping, suddenly fell silent. The world around David felt like it had slowed down, and for the first time that day, a strange unease crept into his gut. He brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the exhaustion of a long day of work. But as he continued to wave at the judge, a sense of tension filled the air, something he couldn't explain but instinctively felt. The calmness that had enveloped the farm just moments ago seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a strange, heavy silence. David's heart began to race, his instincts telling him something was wrong. But before he could even process the feeling, it happened. In the blink of an eye, he was gone. Just like that. One moment, he was standing in the field, and the next, there was nothing. No sound. No trace. It was as if the world had swallowed him whole. There was no flash of light, no gust of wind, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. He was just gone. And as the seconds ticked by, Sarah, still on the porch, would be left to confront a mystery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Sarah Lang stood on the porch, the warmth of the afternoon sun brushing against her skin. She loved these moments, watching her husband work the fields. There was something soothing about seeing him in his element, the way he moved with purpose, as though every step he took was a part of the land itself. She smiled as she looked at him, proud of the life they had built together. Her children, a boy and a girl, were playing near the edge of the yard, their laughter filling the air. The sound of their joy was a constant reminder of how lucky she was to have such a beautiful family. It wasn't always easy, but days like today made everything feel worth it. The farm, the hard work, the sacrifices, they were all part of something bigger. Sarah had always admired David's connection to the earth. He wasn't just a farmer, he was a man whose soul seemed to be intertwined with the land he worked. She had watched him grow from a young boy who dreamed of the farm into a man who made those dreams a reality. And now, as they raised their own children together, it felt as though their little corner of the world was perfect. Her thoughts drifted to their future. She wondered what the years ahead would bring. Would the kids grow up to work the land just like their father? She smiled at the thought, imagining them walking through the fields alongside David, learning the ways of the earth. That was the dream, wasn't it? A life rooted in simplicity, in hard work, and in love for the land. But today, Sarah wasn't just thinking about the future. She was savoring the present. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and her family was together. She felt a sense of peace that only came from moments like these. It was a peace that settled deep in her chest, a quiet contentment that everything was exactly as it should be. From the porch, she could see the movement of the horses in the field. David's steady hands guiding them, his calm voice carrying across the grass. She loved watching him interact with the animals. It was as if they understood each other perfectly, speaking a language of their own. David's connection to them was just another thing that made him unique in her eyes. She couldn't help but admire the way he could calm even the wildest of creatures with just a few words. The children ran past her, their feet kicking up dust as they chased after one another. She called out to them to be careful, but they were too lost in their game to listen. It was a scene that never failed to make her heart swell with love. Her family was everything, and there was nothing she wouldn't do to protect them. She looked back at David, still working in the distance. His movements were precise, his face focused on the task at hand. There was a quiet strength in him, one that only came from years of labor and devotion. Sarah knew that David was more than just a man. He was the heartbeat of their home, the one who kept everything running smoothly, even when life got tough. As Sarah stood there, watching the man she loved work, she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. It wasn't just for the farm or the life they had built, but for the simple fact that they had each other. In a world full of uncertainties, that was the one thing that felt certain. They were in this together, and that thought brought her comfort. The distant sound of a carriage caught her attention. She turned her head and saw Judge August Peck approaching down the dusty road. Sarah smiled, recognizing the judge's familiar face. He was a respected figure in the community, someone David had known for years. His visits were always welcomed, and she was sure he had come to chat with David about something or other. She waved at the judge, her eyes catching the glint of sunlight on his carriage. He waved back, his smile warm and friendly. Sarah's thoughts wandered as she watched him draw closer. It wasn't uncommon for the judge to stop by, especially during harvest season, to check in on David and see how things were going. But today, something felt different. It wasn't anything she could pinpoint, just a nagging sensation deep in her gut. Maybe it was the strange stillness in the air, the way the breeze seemed to die down the moment the judge's carriage came into view. Sarah shook her head, dismissing the thought. It was probably nothing. The heat of the day was making her feel strange, and her mind was just playing tricks on her. Still, as the judge's carriage rumbled closer, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She glanced at David in the field, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. He smiled, as if to reassure her, and Sarah smiled back. But before she could process the thought, the strange feeling in the air grew stronger. It was subtle at first, like a shift in the atmosphere, but it was there. The birds had stopped chirping, and the breeze had completely vanished. The world, it seemed, had grown still. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the silence, it was everything. The way the sunlight suddenly seemed too bright, the way the land felt unnaturally calm. Something was wrong, and Sarah couldn't place why. She glanced back at David once more, trying to make sense of it. He was still working, oblivious to the strange change in the air. As the judge's carriage reached the gate, Sarah's attention snapped back to him. She watched as he waved to David, and David waved back. It was such a simple moment, but it felt as though the entire world had slowed down to witness it. The sensation that something was about to happen grew stronger, and Sarah's heart began to race. The judge's voice broke the silence as he called out to David, but Sarah couldn't hear the words. There was something about the scene that felt surreal. She watched as David acknowledged the judge's presence, still smiling, still waving. It was the most ordinary of moments, yet everything around her felt off. And then, just as quickly as the unease had settled in, it happened. David, her husband, the man she loved, vanished. 1 second, he was there, and the next, he was gone. Just like that. Sarah blinked, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, she thought she had simply lost sight of David. Maybe he had moved out of view, taken a step behind a tree or the barn, something that explained his sudden disappearance. But as the seconds passed, the panic began to settle in. He wasn't there anymore. There was nothing. Just empty space where he had been standing. Her heart began to race, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "David," she called out, her voice trembling. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up. She didn't know why, but she felt an overwhelming need to reach him, to make sure he was okay. The silence around her pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She rushed down the porch steps, her shoes slapping against the wooden steps. Her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what she had just seen, or rather, what she hadn't seen. 1 second, he was there, his broad frame in the distance, the familiar outline of his body framed by the sunlight. The next, gone. As if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. The children, hearing their mother's frantic calls, stopped playing and turned toward her. "Mom, where's Dad?" her son asked, his voice small and uncertain. Sarah could barely hear him over the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. "David?" Sarah's voice cracked as she called out again, her eyes scanning the field. The horses were still grazing lazily, the barn was as it had been, and everything else seemed normal. But David, her husband, her rock, was nowhere to be found. She turned back to the house, hoping, praying that maybe he had gone inside without her noticing. But the front door stood open, just as it had been moments ago. There was no sign of him in the yard, no trace of him anywhere. Her eyes darted around wildly, scanning the trees, the ground, the sky, as if expecting him to materialize from thin air. "David," she shouted, her voice now desperate. It was no longer a question, it was a command, a plea to the world to bring him back. But the world remained still. Not even the wind stirred, not a bird in the sky to answer her cry. Her heart hammered in her chest as panic gripped her. Her thoughts raced, but none of them made any sense. Maybe he had fallen into a hole, perhaps he was playing a prank, hiding somewhere to scare her. She didn't know. She couldn't think straight. She just knew that David was gone, and she was alone in the field with only silence to accompany her. Her legs carried her through the tall grass, each step more frantic than the last. She searched the area in a blur, her eyes darting from side to side, looking for any sign of her husband. But there was nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no sign of a struggle, no hint of where he could have gone. It was as though he had simply disappeared. The field stretched out in front of her, endless and empty. The horizon seemed to mock her, the simplicity of the land contrasting sharply with the chaos inside her. She reached the place where he had been standing, her breath coming in short gasps, her hands trembling. There was no trace of him. No evidence that he had ever been there at all. She felt her knees, her hands brushing the grass, searching for some kind of explanation. There had to be something. Anything that could explain where he had gone. She touched the earth beneath her fingertips, but it was cold and unyielding. It gave no answers, only a stark reminder of how far removed from reality she felt. "David," she screamed again, the word echoing through the stillness. The sound of her voice seemed to reverberate, but there was no reply, no comforting voice calling back to her. The field was empty. The world was empty. And she was left alone, grasping at shadows. Her mind raced back to the events that had just unfolded. She had seen him. She had watched him wave to the judge. She had seen him standing there just a moment ago. And now, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Was it a dream? No, it couldn't have been. She wasn't imagining this. This was real, and it was happening right in front of her. Tears welled in her eyes as the reality of the situation sank in. She wasn't just looking for her husband, she was looking for something she couldn't even understand. How could someone just disappear like that? How could the world simply take him away without a trace? She stumbled back to the house, her mind numb with disbelief. Her thoughts were tangled, each one more impossible than the last. She wanted to shout at the world, demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood in the doorway of their home, staring out at the empty field, her heart heavy with confusion and fear. The children had followed her, their small faces filled with concern. "Where's Dad?" her daughter asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah couldn't bring herself to answer. She didn't have the words. She didn't know what to say. Minutes felt like hours as Sarah stood in the doorway, looking out at the field. Her mind struggled to grasp the situation, to find some sort of rational explanation. But there was none. There was only the empty silence, the endless stretch of land, and the growing panic that was slowly choking the life out of her. Her feet moved before she could think, carrying her back into the field once more. She had to find him. She had to. There was no other choice. Her love for him, her need to have him back, pushed her forward, step after step, as if the force of her will could reverse whatever had happened. But no matter how far she walked, how many times she called his name, David remained gone. And with each passing second, the reality of what had happened settled deeper in her chest. David Lang had vanished. And no one knew why, or where he had gone. Sarah stood there, the weight of the situation slowly pressing down on her chest. Her heart was pounding in her ears, her breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. She couldn't shake the image of David, standing in the field just moments ago, and now, nothing. He was gone. It felt unreal, like some twisted nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over one another, each one more impossible than the last. Was she losing her mind? Had she imagined seeing him? No. She had seen him. She had watched him wave to the judge. She had heard his voice, seen the dust swirl around his boots as he worked. But now, it was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The empty field stretched out before her, mocking her. The land that had been a place of comfort, a place of routine and peace, now felt cold and unwelcoming. She turned back to the house, trying to regain some semblance of control, but even the familiar walls of their home seemed strange. The air felt thick, heavy, as if it had been waiting for something, and now it was suffocating her. "David," she screamed again, her voice cracking. It was a raw, desperate cry, one that seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. The wind didn't stir, The birds didn't chirp. It was as if the world itself had fallen silent, leaving her in a void of isolation. Her children had followed her into the yard, their faces pale and wide-eyed with fear. "Where's Dad, Mom?" her son asked, his voice trembling. The words hit her like a blow to the chest. She had no answer for them. How could she explain something that didn't make sense? How could she tell them that their father had simply vanished into thin air? She knelt down in front of them, trying to hide the panic in her eyes. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said, her voice shaking. "But we're going to find him. Don't worry, okay?" She kissed her son's forehead, trying to reassure him, though her own heart was a tangled mess of dread. Her mind fought to stay focused, but each thought seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. Where could he have gone? It was impossible. They lived in a secluded area, far from the nearest town. There was no place to hide, no one who could have taken him. The idea that something supernatural had happened was absurd. But still, the thought gnawed at the edges of her mind. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We need to search the land. We need to make sure he didn't fall or get hurt somewhere." She stood up, brushing the dust from her knees, and turned to the children. "You stay here. Keep the doors locked, and don't open them for anyone." The children nodded, but Sarah could see the fear in their eyes. They didn't understand what was happening. They didn't understand why their father, their protector, was missing. It was a question Sarah herself couldn't answer. Her feet carried her through the field again, each step more frantic than the last. She was scanning every inch of land, from the barn to the woods on the far side of the farm. She knew it was pointless. There was no sign of him, no clue to where he could have gone. But still, she had to look. She couldn't stop until she found him. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the fields. The light had changed, the world now bathed in a golden hue, but it did nothing to ease the gnawing fear that was consuming Sarah. The world had never felt so alien, so dangerous. What had happened to David? Why had he disappeared? As she moved deeper into the field, she noticed something strange. The air seemed different. Heavier, almost as if the atmosphere itself was charged with tension. She paused, looking around. There was no breeze. Not a leaf stirred. The birds had stopped singing. It was like the world itself was holding its breath. Her mind flashed to the stories she had heard as a child. Tales of people vanishing without a trace, of strange occurrences that couldn't be explained. She had dismissed them as superstitions, but now those stories felt far too real. "David," she called again, but this time, her voice wavered. It was harder to shout now, the words catching in her throat. Her throat was dry, her voice hoarse from the screaming, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. Not now. She reached the far side of the farm, near the edge of the woods. There, in the distance, she saw something. A shadow. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was enough to make her pause. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be him? Could he be standing there, just beyond the tree line, watching her? Sarah's legs carried her forward without thinking. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breath ragged. But as she got closer, the shadow faded. She stopped in her tracks, her chest tightening. The area was empty. There was no one there. No sign of David, no footprints in the dirt. Just the trees, dark and still. Her mind screamed in frustration. What was happening? Where was he? Her body shook with fear, and for the first time, doubt began to creep into her thoughts. What if something had happened to him? What if... No! She couldn't allow herself to think like that. She had to keep going. She retraced her steps, heading back toward the house. The sun was lower now, the sky tinged with deep oranges and purples. The beauty of the sunset did nothing to comfort her. It felt like the calm before a storm, and Sarah couldn't shake the sense that something was coming, something she couldn't control. Her children were still inside, sitting quietly by the window. She could see their faces, pale and fearful. She smiled at them, though the smile felt hollow. "Mommy's going to find him," she whispered to herself, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince them or herself. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door, ready to go back out into the field again. She couldn't stop searching. She wouldn't. Not until she had answers. The fading sunlight seemed to mock Sarah as she stood there, her mind reeling with questions, none of which had answers. The world around her was too still, too silent, and the longer she stood in the middle of the field, the more oppressive it became. The shadows stretched longer, the wind picked up for a brief moment, only to die again. It felt like the earth itself was conspiring against her, refusing to give up its secrets. Her children were inside the house, their faces pale and full of fear. Sarah had barely noticed the fading light, too consumed by the void left by her husband's sudden disappearance. What could have happened to him? It was as if he had been swallowed by the earth, as if he never existed at all. Her mind raced with the most terrifying of possibilities, each darker than the last. Her legs felt heavy, the weight of her worry dragging her down as she turned once again toward the field. She didn't know why she kept searching. Perhaps it was desperation, or maybe the hope that if she just looked hard enough, she would find him standing there, smiling at her with that familiar warmth. But deep down, she knew it was futile. He was gone, and no amount of searching would bring him back. Suddenly, she stopped. There, in the distance, was a flicker of movement. Her heart leaped in her chest as her eyes locked onto the figure. It was David. She knew it had to be him. Her breath caught in her throat as she ran toward him, her feet flying over the dirt and grass, each step echoing louder in her ears than the last. But as she drew closer, something felt off. The figure didn't seem to be moving. It stood still, its back to her, framed by the golden light of the setting sun. "David," she shouted, her voice trembling with relief. But there was no answer. No turn of his head, no familiar greeting. It was as though the person standing before her couldn't hear her at all. Her chest tightened, a cold feeling crawling up her spine. She reached out a hand, desperate to touch him, to make sure it was really him. But as she got closer, the figure seemed to dissolve into the air, melting away like mist before her eyes. Her heart slammed in her chest as she stumbled backward, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. "No," she whispered, her breath ragged. It couldn't be real. This wasn't happening. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to calm down, but when she opened them again, the figure was gone. The field was empty once more, and a cold fear settled over her. Where was David? Where had he gone? She spun around, her eyes darting in every direction, hoping for some sign of him, but there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of land stretching out before her, empty and silent. She took a step back, her eyes welling with tears. The fear was suffocating, and her legs felt like they might give way beneath her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her husband, the man she had built a life with, was gone, and she was alone in the world. Then, as if the earth itself had heard her cry, the wind picked up again. This time, it howled through the field, carrying with it a strange, eerie whisper. Sarah froze, her blood running cold. The voice seemed to echo around her, bouncing off the trees, but it wasn't a voice she recognized. It was distorted, like a cry for help, a pleading call that sent a chill through her bones. "David," she whispered, her voice shaking. But there was no reply, only the wind, carrying the same disembodied whisper. She looked around frantically, her eyes searching the shadows for any sign of movement. The darkness was closing in, but the whisper was still there, faint but unmistakable. Her instincts told her to run, to escape this place, to take her children and leave everything behind. But her feet felt rooted to the spot, as if the ground itself was holding her in place. Her heart was pounding, her breath shallow, and she couldn't tear her gaze away from the swirling shadows in the distance. Then, through the thickening darkness, she saw something, a figure, standing at the edge of the field. It was David. But there was something wrong. His posture was stiff, unnatural, and his face was shadowed, his expression unreadable. She took a hesitant step forward, but the figure didn't move. "David," she called again, her voice trembling with fear. This time, the figure turned its head slowly, almost mechanically, until their eyes met. But it wasn't David's eyes she saw. They were cold, empty, black like voids with no life in them. A scream rose in Sarah's throat, but it was stuck, trapped behind the fear that had paralyzed her. She wanted to run, to turn away, but her body refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from those lifeless eyes that seemed to pierce her soul. And then, in the dead silence of the night, the figure spoke. The voice was not David's. It was deeper, darker, as if it came from somewhere far beyond the earth itself. "Your search is over, Sarah." Her blood ran cold. The voice sent a shiver down her spine. She tried to speak, to ask what it meant, but the words wouldn't come. She was frozen, her body betraying her, and all she could do was watch as the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. "You will never see him again." The words struck her like a physical blow, and a deep, unrelenting sorrow washed over her. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but her body was still paralyzed, unable to move. The figure reached out a hand, and for the first time, Sarah felt an icy coldness emanating from it, as though it came from a place far darker than the world she knew. The hand was close now, just inches from her face, and for a moment, everything stopped. The world, the fear, the pain, it all ceased to exist. She was alone, staring into the abyss that had taken her husband, that had taken everything. And then, as quickly as it had come, the figure vanished. The wind died, the darkness lifted, and the field was empty once more. Her body collapsed to the ground, her hands shaking as she clutched the earth beneath her. Tears streamed down her face, but they were no longer tears of confusion or fear. They were tears of loss, of resignation. David was gone, and she was left to face a world without him, a world that had taken him away in the most unimaginable way. As Sarah sat there, broken and defeated, the whisper returned. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, clearer. It wasn't just the wind. It was the voice of David. But it wasn't a call for help. It wasn't a plea. It was a warning. "Don't look for me," the voice whispered. "You'll only find darkness." And just like that, the silence returned.